In this section, we will manage file system permissions from the command line. Now that we have viewed permissions and begun to interpret what read, write, and execute mean, let's discuss changing permissions and changing ownership of files. I am in the shared directory, and this directory has permissions that allow for the owner root, read, write, and execute, the group wheel, read, write, and execute, and others read and execute. I'm currently logged in as student. My primary group is student, but I'm also a member of the group wheel. This allows me to create new files inside of this directory /home/shared. The new files that I create will have student as the ownership, as well as my primary group, in this case student, as the group affiliation of this file. Other members of the wheel group can also create and delete files in this directory. However, my new file is only readable by those group members in wheel. This is due to the other permissions. In order to open this file up for collaboration, I need to either change the permissions or change the group affiliation of the file. Let's begin by looking at changing permissions. The command that's used to change permissions is chmod. It's sometimes referred to as the chmod command or the change mode command. Looking at the -- help of this command, we see that the basic syntax is the command itself, followed by one or more options, a mode, and then one or more files. The mode is a term that is used to reference the permissions collectively. Of the options that are available, the one of most interest is the R or recursive option. This allows us to change permissions and apply them to a directory and all the files in those directories all at one time. For the mode, there are two methods of specifying the mode. One is a symbolic method, and the other is a numeric or octal mode. For the symbolic method, we use letters and symbols to represent how we want to make a change. For example, we would specify whether we want to change the permissions for the user, also sometimes known as the owner, the group, other, or all three of those permission sets. We use the letters U, G, O, or A. Once we've specified which field we're changing the permissions for, we can add or remove permissions with a plus or a minus. It's also possible to set permissions exactly with an equals. The most common permissions that we will be changing will be the R, W, and X, or read, write, execute permissions that we've already discussed. Notice there are a couple of additional permissions. The S and the T are special permissions, which will be discussed in the next section. The capital X is designed to work specifically with the recursive option. Recall that most directories have read and execute permission, and most files have just read permission. Either could have the write permission or not, depending on the need. If we were to recursively set permissions on a directory and files, it's common that we would want the directories to have execute, but not the files within those directories. The capital X allows for this option. In addition to a symbolic mode, there's also what's called the octal mode or numeric mode. This mode uses numbers or digits to represent the permissions. There would be a digit for each of the fields. The first digit would represent the permissions for the user or owner of the file. The second digit would represent the permissions for the group, and the third digit would represent the permissions for other. Let's look first at using the symbolic mode to change permissions. Again, reviewing files that we have and the permissions specifically on my new file. We have read, write for the owner, read, write for the group, and read for other. If I want to make a change, I use the command chmod. We're going to begin with the symbolic mode, so I'm going to represent what field I want to change. In this case, let's add a write permission to other. So we'll say O for other, a plus to add, a W to add specifically the write permission, and then we will specify the file name. I can then view those permissions and see that the write permission has been added to the other field. You can specify multiple fields and multiple permissions at the same time. For example, I can say that group and other, I want to take away or subtract both read and write on new file. Viewing the permissions, I see that now only the owner has read-write and group and other have no permission at all. If the permissions are to be different for each of these sets, I can also list multiple modes separated by a comma. For example, I could take a G plus RW, put a comma and an O plus R on new file in order to add read and write for the group and only read for others. To make a change with execute, I'd simply add the X options. I could say chmod and owner and group, user and group plus X on the file, and I would add execute permission only for the user and the group. The same syntax works for a directory. I can make a directory and I can look at the permissions on that directory, and I can change the permissions using chmod, and I could, for example, take the group -W on this new directory and then view the permissions and see that I've taken group permission's write ability away. In addition, we have an octal mode. For the octal mode, I use a digit to represent each of the permissions. One digit for the user, one for the group, and one for other. The digit represents collectively the permissions. We have 3 bits, the read bit, the write bit, and the execute bit. If none of them are turned on, dash dash dash, that's an equivalent to a 0. If they're all turned on, RWX, that's equivalent to a 7. The read only would be 4, the write only would be 2, and the execute only would be a 1. So looking back at my new file, I currently have read, write, and execute. 4 plus 2 plus 1 is 7. The group is the same, read plus write plus execute, or 7, and the other is read only, or 4. I can set these same permissions with chmod 774 on the file, and if I view that information, there should be no change. If I want to set the permissions back to a more common permission set for a text file, such as read write for the owner, read for the group, and nothing for others, I use the command and I determine each of the octal bits. Read plus write is 4 plus 2, or 6, for the user or owner. I want read only for the group, which is a 4, and I want nothing for other, which would be a 0. And again, I can view the permissions and see that the changes have been made. Common permissions for a directory would be read, write, execute 7, read and execute 5, or nothing 0. So change mode 750 on my new directory and looking at those permissions would show read, write, execute, read and execute, and dash dash dash. The change mode command can use either symbolic mode, 1 or more entries, or the numeric octal mode. This changes the permissions on an existing file. However, we may at times want to change the ownership or the group affiliation of a file. Again, I have new file, and it's owned by student and a group of student. The chown command allows me to change ownership, can also allow me to change the group affiliation, or both at the same time. However, I do need to be root in order to change the ownership. If I attempt to change the ownership, perhaps give visitor the ownership for new file, I get an operation is not permitted. The root account, however, can change the ownership of a file. So I'll switch to root. I'll return to /home/shared, and again look at new file. And I can do a chown or change own visitor for new file. This time there are no errors, and viewing the permissions and the ownership, I see that visitor is now the owner of this file. In addition to changing the ownership, I can also change the group. If I want to change both at the same time, I say change own, and I specify the owner first, root, for example, and then a colon, and then the group that I want to change it to, perhaps wheel. And I view the contents of the file, or the permissions of the file, and I see that the ownership is now root and the group affiliation is wheel. If I want to change just the group, I simply leave off the user field, and I start with a colon. Change own, colon, student on new file. And looking at the permissions, I see that the owner is still root. The group has been changed to student. The permissions themselves have not been changed at all. I'll change this back to being owned by student, since only root can do that. And we're back to the original scenario of the new file being owned by student and associated with the group student. I'll exit the root shell, returning to the user student. While I was not able to change the ownership of the file, I am able to change the group affiliation for new file as an ordinary user. I own it, so I'm allowed to make changes to the permissions, and I'm also allowed to make changes to the group affiliation with one restriction. I must be a member of the groups that are involved, both the source group and the destination group. For example, I'm not allowed to change this file and have it a part of visitor group. That operation is not permitted. I can change it back to student because I am a member of the group student as well as the group wheel, which is what I have been changing it to and from. Finally, looking at the permissions to confirm the change. In order to share files amongst users, I may need to change permissions, or I may need to change group or owner settings. The owner of a file can change the group affiliation with some limitations and any of the permissions. The root user can change permissions, ownership, and group affiliation for any file. Change mode is used to change the permissions, and change own is used to change the ownership or the group affiliation.